Despite the US president's claims that he had reached a deal with Russia to end the Ukraine war, Zelensky wasted no time in making his stance clear. He will not accept any agreement that Ukraine is not a part of. The Ukrainian leader's rejection of a deal brokered without his involvement has sent shockwaves through Europe, triggering an emergency meeting among European leaders. As the situation stands, a major shift is unfolding within NATO, and some even argue that a split in the alliance could be imminent. But the bigger question remains, how likely is a direct war between NATO and Russia? And if such a conflict were to break out, could NATO survive without the full backing of the United States? While the brutal conflict continues along the Ukrainian front lines, the world's attention turned to Saudi Arabia, where high-ranking representatives from Russia and the United States met to discuss possible peace terms. But conspicuously absent from the discussions was Ukraine. Instead, Zelensky found himself in Turkey, making it abundantly clear that he would not accept any deal negotiated behind Ukraine's back. His refusal to recognize Russian-occupied Ukrainian territories as anything but sovereign Ukrainian land further escalated tensions. After the talks, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called the discussions useful, but strongly opposed the idea of any form of peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, calling it completely unacceptable. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, however, appeared optimistic, telling reporters that he was convinced Russia was serious about ending the war. But when questioned about the absence of Ukraine and its European allies, Rubio was quick to insist that nobody was sidelined. The outcome of the meeting: both countries agreed to appoint teams tasked with negotiating an end to the war. But no progress was made toward arranging a potential meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Zelensky looked visibly frustrated as he addressed reporters in Turkey. The Ukrainian leader, who had planned to visit Saudi Arabia this week, abruptly postponed the trip until mid-March after the details of the US-Russia talks emerged. The reaction from European leaders was swift. UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer stressed that a US security guarantee for Ukraine was necessary to deter future Russian aggression. Other European leaders echoed his concerns, but behind closed doors, tensions are brewing as NATO allies struggle to form a united stance. NATO has long been hailed as the world's most powerful military alliance, but cracks in its unity are beginning to show. The uncertainty surrounding US involvement only adds to the chaos. French President Emmanuel Macron's 2019 warning that NATO was becoming brain-dead seems more relevant now than ever. At the time, Macron pointed to signs that the US was turning its back on us. And now, with Washington striking separate deals with Russia, some European leaders fear their worst nightmare could be materializing. Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 changed everything, proving that large-scale land wars in Europe weren't just a relic of the past. In fact, in 2023, the respected Institute for the Study of War warned that Putin was preparing Russia for a potential future conflict with NATO. Russian forces have been repositioned near Finland, Latvia, and Estonia, an unmistakable sign that the Kremlin has its eyes on NATO's eastern border. The restructuring of the Russian military and Putin's increasingly aggressive rhetoric confirm what many experts have suspected. Russia sees NATO as an enemy, and the threat to Western security is very real. For decades, NATO has relied on one critical pillar: the idea that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is supposed to guarantee that NATO allies stand together in the face of aggression. But Ukraine's situation exposes a serious flaw in the alliance's structure. Because Ukraine is not a member, NATO is not obligated to defend it. And with NATO members split over how much more military and financial aid they're willing to send, the alliance's credibility is now being called into question. One of NATO's core promises is that member states should spend at least 2% of their GDP on defence. But the reality is that fewer than a third of NATO members meet this target. The alliance's most powerful force, the United States, has historically carried the bulk of the burden. But with growing concerns over whether Washington will stay committed to NATO in the long run, European leaders are now facing a harsh reality. They may need to prepare for a future in which NATO must stand without US military backing. The idea of NATO going to war against Russia without US involvement sounds unthinkable. The United States accounts for nearly 70% of NATO's total military spending, and without American troops, air power and strategic coordination, the alliance would be at a severe disadvantage. Some experts argue that Europe alone has the capability to contain Russian aggression, but there's no denying that NATO without the US is a much weaker force. One of NATO's biggest weaknesses is its dependency on American-made weapons, satellites, and intelligence. If Washington pulls back, Europe would be forced to rapidly scale up its own military production, a process that takes years, not months. And with Russia already making advances on NATO's eastern border, time is not on their side. As tensions escalate, the possibility of a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia is no longer a far-fetched scenario. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine has already seen an increase in Russian military activity near NATO borders. Just last month, Russian fighter jets violated Finnish airspace for the third time in 6 months. Estonia has reported cyber attacks originating from Russian state-backed hackers, and Latvia has accused Moscow of attempting to interfere in its political affairs. These provocations are testing NATO's patience, and the question now is, how much longer can the alliance avoid direct confrontation? If a war between NATO and Russia were to break out, Europe would be the primary battlefield. Countries like Poland, Lithuania, and Germany would bear the brunt of the conflict. And while NATO still maintains military superiority on paper, Russia's willingness to engage in brutal, prolonged warfare could make this a much costlier battle than many Western leaders are prepared for. European countries are nowhere near as strong without the United States, and if it comes down to it, Russia could make quick work of the situation. The best course of action would be for Zelensky to sit down and seriously negotiate peace deals before things escalate further. At this point, prolonging the conflict isn't doing Ukraine any favours. The West's support has its limits, and without the US fully backing them, Ukraine's position becomes far more vulnerable. Meanwhile, Russia isn't showing any signs of backing down, and the longer this drags on, the worse it gets for Ukraine. A prolonged war only leads to more destruction, more casualties, and a weaker future for the country. The reality is that peace talks are the only way to prevent further devastation. Ignoring this fact won't change the situation on the ground. The sooner Zelensky realises that negotiations are necessary, the better. If he continues to rely on Western aid while refusing to explore diplomatic solutions, Ukraine risks suffering even greater losses. Instead of holding out for unrealistic victories, it's time to acknowledge the need for diplomacy and start working toward a solution before it's too late. With Zelensky rejecting any peace deal that excludes Ukraine, and with Russia showing no sign of backing down, NATO is now at a critical crossroads. The next few months will determine whether the alliance can maintain its unity or whether the cracks in its foundation will deepen beyond repair. One thing is certain, the war in Ukraine is far from over, and the possibility of NATO being dragged into a direct conflict with Russia is more real than ever. But if push comes to shove, will NATO be able to stand strong, especially if the United States decides to step back? What's your take on this escalating crisis? Do you think NATO can hold its ground without the US? Or are we witnessing the beginning of the alliance's downfall? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to check out our next video covering the latest developments in this ongoing geopolitical showdown.